Hi, I'm Ed, N9MW, and the real title for this talk ought to be A Comprehensive View of Station Grounding for the Ham. That's kind of stuffy. Here's three other titles you can take your pick out of as you might like. Okay, as I said, we're going to talk about grounding in the station shack. And the first thing we need to discuss is what is a perfect ground? And a perfect ground is a point of zero impedance to the passing or receiving electrons. That means there isn't any building up of charges on anything. There's no energy being coupled magnetically to other sources or outputs. And there's no plain old resistance making heat to ground. In other words, a perfect ground is an electronic outhouse, a place where we can dump any unwanted electricity. Why would this be important? Well, there's several reasons. First of all, many circuits just don't like floating around in some arbitrary value, voltage value, reference value. And secondly, if you're trying to make measurements, you guess you'd really like to know where zero is. But more importantly, for our discussions today, providing a zero voltage for reference for safety is absolutely necessary. Now, originally, I got my first taste of lightning protection from a Professor Bernstein, who did several lectures or talks, presentations to our radio club. Professor Bernstein was a professor of electricity and electrocution, and spent his time studying thousands and thousands of lightning strikes. He came to conclusion that lightning is in every continent. Lightning doesn't seem to pay much attention to the local contour. So a perfectly logical scientific conclusion is it's not if, but when you're going to get struck by lightning. Now that sounds rather rash, but think about it. How many times have you in your life heard a lightning crash and said, that's getting awful close? So it's about us and around us and not very far from us a lot of the time. The second thing we hit him up about was a cone of protection. And his answer was, well, it's roughly the height of whatever object it is, in my case here, where the drawing is a tower and an antenna, to the width. But you notice I stuck a flagpole off to the side, and even though the base is within a cone of protection, a lightning strike in that particular case is every bit as likely to go to that lower flagpole than the upper antenna. In fact, at one house I lived at, I was about 10 feet higher elevation, two-story house, 65-foot tower, mast sticking out of the top. And storm came, and my neighbor, about 125 feet away, got a hole blown through his roof into the wiring and the electrics in his house. Took out every piece of electronic equipment, including entire home theater. There's other ways, of course, that just other than a direct lightning strike, that voltage can get induced. Again, we drew a tower, but it could be a tree, could be a building, could be a telephone pole rising, and the lightning strikes that. Now, lightning is a charge of 50,000 to 200,000 amperes, amperes, not volts. And of course, across, let's say that tower offered 5 ohms of resistance from top to bottom. That means at some point it's developing more than 750,000 volts, if you want to think in terms of volts. But thinking in terms of amperes, amperes is current. Current has magnetic fields. The magnetic fields will affect everything in the vicinity, including down grounds on power poles, wiring in your house, water, heating, communications, cables, etc. In a recent article I saw, I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's just say the conclusion was that at 100 feet away, something in the neighborhood of 40,000 volts was induced. And that certainly is not only damaging to equipment, but it also is a lethal voltage. So we have to consider human beings involved in this as well. Okay, so what's to do about it? First of all, let's go back to just having our antenna out there, in this case, a tower and a beam on it. And what do we got? We've got a nice big fat coax. That's the red line. And the outer conductor is very low resistance. It's going to be subject to that current, to that lightning strike, and it's going to carry it via very few ohms to your house. While there's grounding at the tower, the dirt is relatively lousy conductor, especially compared to the shield of that coax. So at the house, here's the first important point. Everything needs to be bonded together. When that lightning hits, you want everything in the house to go to that voltage. And if the voltages are all the same, everything within it is safe. There's no voltage difference to create any current flows through things like people or equipment. So first point is everything gets bonded together. I've got on the drawing single point ground. Don't get too concerned about the idea of single point, because it actually could be more of a bus bar or whatever, as long as it was big and conducted a lot of current. But that's not all of it. Now, we were talking about 50 to 200,000 amperes of current, and it's looking for a place to go. And we really don't want it going through our electric wires, through the house, or through our water pipes or anything else in the house. We'd like to have it go somewhere else. So we have a ground rod outside the house. Again, dirt isn't a great conductor. It's there, it's ground, but it's not a real superconductor. The path through all the rest of that conductors in your house is much better. So we're in search of that perfect ground that we just discussed at the beginning of the talk. Once upon a time, maybe when the only network there was gas pipes for gas lighting, etc., the iron gas pipes were considered the universal ground. I suspect somewhere along the line, somebody said, why are we hooking sparky stuff to pipes that are running explosives and combustibles? So the water lines became the primary ground and were for years. However, it seems as though water people started using plastic pipe. And they were, as I recall, actually, there were lawsuits trying to get them to retain their copper and steel pipes, lead if you were in Michigan, out there for a common ground. And the water company said, that's not our business. It's not our problem. Go somewhere else. So that left us with the power company ground. And frankly, it's probably the one we should have been using in the first place. One of those wires up there in those power poles is a neutral. It's grounded at every other pole. Every house or business it goes to, there should be 2 ground rods driven in, and it should be connected into the center of your center conductor of your circuit breaker box. That in turn should have a number 4 copper wire going down the outside of your building to the 2 ground rods at your home. There is our access to our perfect ground. We need to get from that single point where the single point ground is shown over to that green line where the power company ground is. And that is the standard. You build that with big enough conductor that it will be the first choice for all of that current to go. In my case, I knew all of this before I built my shop, and yeah, it's a mess back there. But you'll see a ground rod sticking up through the ground. There's a whole bunch of wire number 4 copper wire under the floor, around the outside of the building, over the top of the building, you name it, ground rods in all 4 corners. And you notice that the conductors to it are copper strap. They're bolted, clamped onto that ground rod, and then a torch was taken and heated up and soldered so that that was so that there was a no noise connection. A little bit more likely what you will run into, this in fact is a TV installation. It's at the other end of my house from a lot of stuff, but you can see the wires coming out of the conduit from the tower. And you can also see a ground wire coming through that passes to a couple of metal strips. Those strips are actually readily available at the hardware stores. They're used for adding neutral and ground positions inside a circuit breaker box. There's a lot of good stuff right around that area. In my case, I had to take the number 4 and unbraid it a bit and stick it through 2 holes in order to get it through those connectors. You'll see one wire that goes down under the floor and comes out the other end of the building. It's actually in the cement per the way Motorola says to put in a ground. And the other ground wire that you see going up goes up and bonds to a bunch of copper water pipes that just happen to be immediately above this location. At the other end of the house, it's an angled extension, and all of my utilities come in there. It just so happens that all of the electric, all the water, and the gas all come by. So that was a very handy place to do an awful lot of my bonding. Also, it is where the ground leaves and goes down to my shop, where I've the path going down there. I just took 2 electrical wire, stripped the insulation off it, and laid it in the ground above the conduits. And so the grounding is tied together between the house and the shop. Okay, let's talk a little bit about lightning arresters. A basic lightning arrestor is going to just simply connect through the shield of your coax. And it's going to give you a bolt or something that you can connect to our perfect ground. However, that doesn't account for the fact that the inside voltage could be on the center conductor could be different than the shield. So they install a gas arc plug so that if there's a great difference in voltage, that plug will arc and get them reasonably similar in voltage. Doesn't do a squat for anything going back towards the tower, but it does towards the equipment. If the voltages applied both to the chassis and the innards of your radio equipment are essentially the same, no damage will be done to your equipment. Is this true? I'd say so. I've probably been struck 11, 12 times by lightning, and in some of those cases, I had a DX packet cluster system up and running with 3 UHF VHF backbone links on it, and there was never any damage done to them, and those things actually survived lightning strikes without ever skipping a beat. And some examples of lightning arresters. Polyphaser is a well-known professional version. The top left is one with 2 conductors on it. That's used primarily for telephone. The bottom right is a coax version from Polyphaser. And there's something that you got to know about that. First of all, they are probably the most expensive of all of them, but they're specifically designed for use in conjugately matched 50 ohm transmission lines. And people that have long wires and tuners and other stuff they're feeding through them have a real tendency to burn them out. So save your money. That's not the way to go. On the bottom left is a earlier version of an alpha delta lightning arrestor. The arc plug is down inside that little box underneath where that ring terminal is. In the center bottom is a more modern version, and the arc plug is down under that knurled knob at the top. And then just for reference, there's a 4-position switch, antenna switch, in which the arc plug is actually under that screw cap that's right above the L and delta. What to do about a balance line tuner? Now, in this case, I'm showing 2 coaxes, which serve as a balance line off a balance line tuner, going out to my random length dipole. What I did was I used a couple of 6-inch lengths of braid. I used large electrical connectors, and when it's not in use, I ground the 2 connectors. Again, noting that they're staying together, they're remaining connected at all times. The other thing about it is that if you grab a hold of something, you're grabbing a hold of ground. You're not grabbing a hold of anything hot. A friend of mine years ago put up a dipole. In the middle of the night, he heard a storm coming and remembered he hadn't disconnected his antenna. And so he went over to disconnect his antenna. The next thing he knew, he was sitting across the room shaking like a leaf. Just not a good idea to mess with lightning, especially when it's too late. Some of the hardware that's available is almost all of it you can find right in ordinary hardware stores. I really like the split bolts, the assortment of 4 across the top, and I'm sure there's more. The one on the right, probably you can get a couple of number 12s through. The one on the left is probably a 1/2 inch. Another type of connector is one that just jams the 2 wires together, such as the bottom left. The bottom center one, I don't know what that was for. I don't know where I picked that up. I think that was for bonding strand together. And the bottom right is a ring terminal, but there are much better ring terminals around. You never probably would guess it, but if you go to your automotive store, in the drawers back behind the counter, they have some really big honking copper ring terminals, and a torch and some solder, and away you go, making some really fine connectors. And they're used, of course, for making starter cables and so forth, and in that environment. Of course, the connections, especially the ones outside, should have some antioxidant on them. Here's Ideal Noalox, a couple bucks for that, I think, maybe more. Oxguard is another one, and I'm sure there's more. But a little dab rubbed on it can go a long ways in protecting connections. What do you work with? Well, hauling soldering irons around outside usually it's kind of difficult. You usually can't get enough heat because of the wind. So I, generally speaking, use my little Weller portable soldering iron, gas soldering iron. But I found one at the hardware store that's probably 10 times the size of that flame and about 1/10 the size of a full house plumber's torch. And it has a very fine, well-defined flame on it, and it's very easy to use. And I really like that one. That's the black one with a hose. You need to use on this stuff. You need to use a compound, a resin. Do not use acid core. Use rosin core. I just use a plain old ordinary roll of a large gauge solder for the purposes out there. If you dig around a little bit in the plumbing store, you'll even find stuff that's got silver content in it if you choose to go that harder solder. Other connectors that are readily available in hardware stores. The top 2 are for clamping onto pipes and masts. The middle 2 are for ground rods. I much prefer the more solid one on the right. The bottom left is back when I worked in the phone company as an installer 50 years ago. And when we grounded to water pipes, that was one that I probably took off of something, put in my pocket. It came home, got thrown in the junk box, and this is the first time it's been seen since. Who says things don't have an afterlife? Another connector is on the bottom, is for grounding to I-beams and the likes. And The one on the right, the bottom right, is just a single version of what I showed earlier, the strips for putting neutral into electrical boxes, but they can be used for an awful lot of things. And screwed to anything, and away you go with them. Just to see a couple of, give you an idea of those through bolt. Here's a couple of the large ones holding some wires together on my tower. The actual grounding is done with those clamps that are seen down at the base of the legs. Just an aside to note, the cement in this tower, when it was poured, and in fact all of my towers, is poured just to ground level, and then it's domed. It does two things. Water does not pocket around the legs, rusting it. And it turns out that when it's, if you're in a climate that's cold and snowy, the metal legs will tend to warm this up, and it'll melt off faster than anything else around it and dry up quicker. The other advantage is this: I can run the lawnmower right up onto the edge and don't have to fool around with any special instruments trying to trim the grass around it. Talking about grounding in the shack. Well, under my workbench, I thought to myself, how am I going to get a big ground across here, a big low level, low impedance ground? And what immediately came to mind was, why not use a chunk of 3/4 inch copper tubing? So drilled some 3/16 holes through it and soldered in some 3/16 brass screws. And by the way, the ring terminal you see on there is one of those terminals I was telling you about that can be gotten at the local auto store. Another little discussion I'd like to have about grounding and lightning protection is people that put up a tower, put an antenna up of some sort or another, and because UHF, VHF is absolutely reliant on height over ground, the first thing people do is put their UHF antenna right square on top of that mast on top of the tower. I'm going to suggest that that's not the best place for it. You might really think about putting some sidearms and putting it down lower. I don't know how many times. I'm sure it's at least 25 times I've heard stories of people saying, yep, I came out this morning and there's white fiberglass all over my backyard. Now, there's no guarantees putting it down low is going to save its bacon, but at least it's got a fighting chance there. And that's where mine are. And I reported earlier that I had packet cluster links that stayed up through direct hits even. The other thing I heard the other day was, well, why don't we put a cap on the top of that plastic up there and stop that top from discharging? Well, that's not a good idea. That is your friend up there. There are some theories about lightning protection that are really, they're really not determined yet. But if you talk to the lightning protection people, they put little spikes across the roofs of buildings and try to discharge the atmosphere around them. Whether or not that actually reduces the number of lightning strikes is, well, in a way, it's kind of academic, because if nothing else, what they've done is provided a high capacity circuit to ground and to protect what's underneath them. But it is possible. It is possible, in fact, that a point like that is discharging the atmosphere immediately around it and causing the lightning to strike elsewhere. And I'm not, I don't know if you're cognizant of this theory. It's another one that's unproven, and not necessarily, well, the jury's still out on it. Let's put it that way. That the way lightning strikes is, first of all, the bolt goes back and forth 3 or 4 times, probably from overshoot, and it does it at a frequency that's HF radio frequencies. Subsequently, possibly the sound that we hear on our radios when there's a lightning strike 100 miles away. But the other theory is that the leaders coming out of the clouds towards Earth, well, actually towards each other if they're in the clouds, are approximately the wavelength of an HF frequency. And every time one of those leaders forms, it sends out a bit of radio energy. Those leaders, in fact, can build a leader from them, from the first one, and ultimately on and on and on until that it reaches ground or mates up to some leaders coming from the opposite voltage elsewhere. So where does the RF signal come from that we hear with the lightning on our radios from lightning? Could be either one. And it's it's just interesting to think about it. On your workbench, grounding. I have yet to blow up any transistors due to a static charge. But in all fairness, I have to admit, I don't work with them all that often. But I do have this mat. It's about, I don't know, 25 bucks, I guess. It's got a little connector off the side. I can put a wrist strap on. And if nothing else, it's sure done a great job of protecting my tabletop. You can see all the solder and garbage that would have been on the tabletop otherwise. I really recommend that you go with that little bit of safety. One last thing to discuss is whole house protectors. In the particular house I'm in right now, it's most interesting in that I just, as a whim, decided, well, maybe I ought to put a whole house protector in. Lots of stuff was on surge protectors and on UPSs and everything else. But I thought, oh, let's put in a whole house one. What I noticed within a couple of months was I wasn't burning out light bulbs, especially three-way light bulbs anymore. It convinced me right then and there it's doing something, and that something is good. This particular one, you'd probably have to have an electrician install. It goes adjacent to your circuit breaker box. If you've got the right and can find it, the right circuit breaker boxes, you can plug in a unit like this. You could do it yourself. It just plugs in, but it does exactly the same thing. So that's the end. Everything I've said is either well documented, or I try to stress that it was an opinion or it was an observation. But I'll leave you with a thought from PDQ Bach that truth is simply truth. You can't have opinions about truth. So get those stations commonly bounded and get them bonded to the power company.